John's choice wine. John chapter 2. Many people are familiar with the story of Jesus turning the water into wine. But have you ever reflected on the reason Jesus had for doing so? In his book, The Wonder-Working God, Jared C. Wilson put it this way. John tells us the purpose of this miracle, which happens to be the purpose of all Jesus' miracles. Jesus' purpose is to manifest his glory. Some people get carried away with the details of the story. Did Jesus really get away with calling his mother woman without getting severely reprimanded? Did Jesus make wine and lots of it? Or was it just some form of grape juice? But these questions, interesting as they may be, are not at the heart of the story. Sometimes we let our questions distract us from the author's intent. Let's read the story again as it is recorded in John 2, 1 through 11, as if we are reading it for the first time. Let's note the explanation as to why Jesus publicly demonstrated this miraculous sign. Jesus was invited to a wedding. John 2, 1 and 2. The wedding was on. The Apostle John begins the story with the words, "On the third day," verse 1. In chapter 1, John had referred to 4 days in Jesus' early ministry. Why would he begin the second chapter by talking about the third day as opposed to the 5th day? Commentators have suggested a variety of options. Most likely this was the 3rd day of Jesus' journey. Near the end of chapter 1, John stated that Jesus had left Judea for Galilee, verse 43. This journey could easily take 2 days on foot, and Jesus would have arrived at the wedding on the 3rd day, verse 1. A wedding took place. Verse 1. Wedding celebrations are important events in any culture, but in the Middle Eastern culture in which Jesus lived, a wedding celebration was often a week-long event. During this event, it was the responsibility of the master of the banquet to make sure that everyone had enough to eat and drink. To run out of provisions would be considered shameful. Cana in Galilee, verse 1, was a small town not too far away from Nazareth where Jesus grew up in his parental home. The words Jesus' mother was there, verse 1, implies that she had arrived before Jesus and his disciples. She may have been involved in the wedding in some way. Later in the story, she is aware of the difficult situation the wedding hosts are facing. This information would not have been shared with just anyone at the wedding. Most likely, Mary was involved in planning and serving at this wedding. Mary was at the wedding when Jesus arrived. The fact that Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding, verse 2, suggests that the couple getting married were close friends or perhaps family members of Jesus' family. Joseph is not mentioned in the text. He may have passed away by now. Jesus would have been the oldest male in his family. This would have made him a desired guest at the wedding. Jesus was informed of a need, verses 3 to 5. The wine was gone. John does not specifically say when it happened, but simply that it happened before the wedding was over. This situation could lead to shame. If the guests did not have enough to eat or drink, it was a disgrace to the hosts. Their reputations would be ruined in the community. Jesus' mother challenged him to take action. She said to him, "They have no more wine," verse 3. Mary was making sure that Jesus was aware of the need. Anything more than that was not necessary. Jesus knew the shame that would come to the family that he loved. Jesus would know what to do with the information. Jesus challenged his mother's assumption. He asked her, "Why do you involve me?" verse 4. Jesus was a grown man. He had already begun his itinerant ministry. He had already called his disciples. Mary's direct authority over him had come to an end. Jesus was working out the will of his Father in heaven. He knew that the time to reveal himself to the world had not yet come. He clearly communicated this to his mother when he told her, "My time is not yet come," verse 4. He was telling his mother that it was not appropriate for her to rush things. Mary was desperate. She could not accept no for an answer. She spoke to the servants and said, "Do whatever he tells you." She knew that there was a genuine need. She knew that Jesus was full of compassion. She did not know what Jesus was going to do. She did know that whatever he would ask the servants to do needed to be done. Obedience is the only appropriate response when Jesus is giving the directions. The servants obeyed Jesus' instructions, verses 6 to 8. His words were obeyed. Jesus observed the situation. He saw that there were 6 large stone water jars near him. These jars were used by the Jews for their ceremonial washings. In other words, these jars were used to hold bath water. Each jar held about 25 gallons of water. 6 jars filled with 25 gallons each would hold a total of 150 gallons. This was a significant amount of water. Jesus told the servants to fill the jars with water, verse 7. The servants obeyed. They did what Jesus told them to do. Each jar was filled to the brim. Then Jesus gave them another set of instructions. Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet, verse 8. Wait a minute. These jars were not approved to hold drinking water. These jars were used to hold bathing water. Furthermore, the people at the banquet were not expecting to be served water. They were expecting to be served wine. If the servants wrestled with any of these issues, we are not told. All we know from the record is that the servants obeyed. This is what Mary asked them to do. This is what they were expected to do. This is what they did. The master was impressed by the wine, verses 9 and 10. The water was transformed. The master of the banquet tasted the water. The master was not the groom, but the equivalent of a wedding coordinator. The text tells us that the water had been turned into wine. The master did not realize where this wine had come from. Only the servants who had drawn the water were aware of this. Then the master of the banquet went to talk to the bridegroom. The words he said give us a clue as to the meaning of this sign. He referred to a common practice at the time. Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests had too much to drink, verse 10. In other words, you impress people at the beginning when they are alert and able to appreciate the quality you have to offer. After they have been duly impressed, you can give them the less expensive and less impressive wine. This was the way things were done. Everyone knew it and expected it to be done this way. Even though this was the common practice, the master of the banquet noticed that the bridegroom had done something quite differently. He gave a compliment to the bridegroom when he said, "But you have saved the best till now," verse 10. Remember what the master of the banquet was talking about. He was referring to the ordinary water that had been poured into these large jars. When the servants obeyed Jesus, this water had been miraculously transformed into choice wine. It was the best wine the master of the banquet had tasted for a while. This was not a cheap trick. Jesus had changed ordinary water into high-quality wine. This demonstrated that there was nothing ordinary about Jesus. He was very special. Throughout the history of Israel, God had spoken to his people many times. He spoke to them through the judges. He spoke to them through the prophets. The author of Hebrews put it this way: in the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. Hebrews 1:1-3. When God sent Jesus, God did what the bridegroom is credited with doing in this story. He has saved the best till now, verse 10. The prophets declared the word of God to the people. Jesus was the word of God in human flesh, John 1:1. Jesus used this sign to reveal his glory. He is not the limited wine that runs out and leaves you feeling empty. He is not the cheap wine that is served to people after they don't care what they are drinking anymore. He is God's choice wine. God has saved the best until now. When the disciples realized what Jesus had done, they put their faith in him. Would you consider doing what they did? Who did this miraculous sign point toward? The changing of the water into wine pointed toward Jesus. Jesus is God's choice wine.